Hello. Today I'd like to discuss some concepts from Chapter 7 of Maxfield and Babbie, and Chapter 7 is all about experimental and quasi-experimental designs. So before we jump into design, I just want to give you guys a rundown of the design typologies. So there's three basic types of designs. There's experimental designs, quasi-experimental designs, and non-experimental designs. And this introduction isn't in the textbook, but I'm just giving it to you to provide some context and hopefully to make your life a little bit easier so that you can understand design a little bit better. So an experimental design, the purpose is to test a causal relationship between an independent and dependent variable. Typically, an experimental design involves a pre-test and a post-test, and we will see a treatment and a control group, and also the presence of random assignment. And if you're confused about what this terminology means, don't worry, I'll go over it in more detail in just a minute. But I want to first just introduce you to the design types and highlight the differences among them. So the quasi-experimental design, this is also a test of a causal relationship between an independent and dependent variable. There may be pre-tests and post-tests, but not always. In quasi-experimental designs, we have a treatment and a comparison group. So whenever you're talking about a quasi-experiment, we refer to the control group as a comparison group. And the key difference between quasi-experimental and true experimental designs is this lack of a random assignment mechanism. So quasi-experiments do not have random assignment. And then finally, there's our non-experimental design. Again, the goal is to test a causal relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. Non-experimental designs have measures of the independent-dependent variables and statistical analyses demonstrating correlational relationships, but they do not have a treatment or control or comparison group, and they do not have random assignment. So basically, they're missing all the key elements of true and quasi-experimental designs. So the best way to think about experimental designs and how this all plays together is to use the medical model analogy. So the pharmaceutical industry uses experiments to test the effectiveness of new drugs. So let's just say that a university comes up with a new drug that's supposed to treat cancer. One of the first questions is this drug actually effective? Does it actually help cancer patients by reducing their symptoms? So they do an experiment to test its effectiveness. And so basically what would happen is they would take a group of, let's say, 50 cancer patients, and then they would use a random assignment mechanism to randomly assign those patients one by one to either be in the treatment group, and the treatment group gets the new experimental drug, or they would assign them to be in the control group, and the control group basically gets standard cancer treatments. And the researchers would then follow these groups of patients, these two groups of patients, over time and see how their disease progresses. And if the new cancer drug is truly effective, we should see improvement in the treatment group that is receiving the cancer drug. And we should see the control group doing about the same. So again, we want more improvement in the treatment group and the control group to be doing about the same. So that's great for the medical and pharmaceutical industries, but what about criminal justice? Well, we can do experiments in criminal justice and criminology as well, and the same basic idea applies. So, for instance, there are a lot of programs that work on offenders and trying to reduce recidivism. So, if we take a group of juvenile offenders, maybe in juvenile detention, we might want to expose some of them to a program that teaches them job training skills so that when they're released from detention, they're able to get a job and hold it down. So what we might do is go to a juvenile detention facility to test this program, and we'll take maybe say 50 juvenile offenders, and we'll randomly assign 25 to receive this job training program and 25 to receive nothing. And then we follow that group of 50 offenders after they're released, and we see how many of them are able to get jobs and how many of them are able to hold the jobs down. And if this program is truly effective, we should see more juveniles in the treatment group being able to get jobs and hold them down. Another way that we see this a lot of times is in policing. So there's a lot of experiments to evaluate the effectiveness of different policing interventions. So we might take a number of hotspots in a city. So a hotspot is just an area where we know that there is a disproportionate amount of crime. So we might take, again, I'll just say 50 violent crime hotspots, and we randomly assign 25 to receive community policing and problem solving. And then the other 25 will just get standard police service. And then we'll track the calls for service and crime reporting over time. And if community policing really works, we should see a reduction of crime in the treatment hotspots that receive the community policing intervention, whereas crime should stay about the same in the control areas. So basically, that's how we use experiments in criminal justice. So experiments are best suited for explanation and evaluation. So they're really hitting on those last two purposes of research, explanation and evaluation. And in its most basic form, an experiment just involves taking an action and then observing the consequences. So we introduce something like community policing, and then we see the effect of that community policing on crime. So the classic experiment is most often used to evaluate programs of this nature, and it has three major components. So a pre-test and a post-test, an experimental group and a control group, and random assignment of units to those groups. And so I'll talk about this a little bit more in depth. So first off, we need to talk about the variable relationship. So an experiment examines the effect of an independent variable on a dependent variable. Okay. And when we talk about it in experimental terms, the independent variable is usually dichotomous. So if we have a group of 100 inmates, and let's say 50 of them are going to get a job training program and 50 will receive nothing, we can code those inmates in our database as 0, meaning they get nothing, and 1, meaning they get the job training program. Okay, so that's what it means by dichotomous. It's either present or absent. All right. And as with any independent-dependent variable relationship, we're always thinking of the independent variable as the cause and the dependent variable as the effect. So the independent variable for working with offenders in job training, the program itself is the cause, and then the effect is that they maintain a job once they're released. Okay, so we're hoping that by exposing offenders to this job training program, that it'll have a positive effect and that they'll be able to maintain a job once they're released. So the simplest design, a subject is measured on some kind of a dependent variable. That's the pretest. They're then exposed to the independent variable. Okay, and then they're remeasured once again on the dependent variable or the post-test to see if there was an effect. And if there are differences between the first and second measurement, then we attribute those usually to the independent variable, and then we can say that the independent variable was effective and that it did perform the way it should in this cause and effect relationship. So talk a little bit about experimental and control groups. So an experimental group, these are the folks in the experiment who actually receive the treatment. Okay, so like the cancer example, these are the people that be getting the new drug. In the inmate example, these would be the people that are actually getting the job training. The control group is just simply subjects who do not receive the experimental treatment. So again, if we go back to the cancer example, these would be the folks that that basically they just get standard cancer treatments. Or if we think about the inmates, these are the inmates that get nothing. Okay. The whole reason that we have control groups are for these two reasons. One is to control for the effect of the experiment itself. So we know that people tend to act differently if they're in an experiment, and this is called the Hawthorne effect. And so the control group can help us sort of eliminate that problem because we can see how the experiment is affecting not just our people in the treatment group, but the folks in the control group as well. Also, having a control group will help us rule out internal validity threats that may come in from outside the experiment. And the book also briefly mentions this concept of the double-blind experiment. So Not only can bias come from people within the experiment, not only do people in the experiment involved as subjects change their behavior, but we know researchers change their behavior too, because we know that the treatment group should be doing better than the control group. And so researchers can have a bit of bias and a bit of an agenda when they walk into an experiment. So in a double blind experiment, it's set up in such a way that the folks involved in the experiment as test subjects don't know that they're in the treatment group or the control group, and also the researchers don't know which group is the treatment group and control group. So again, you get that extra layer of protection against bias. So in selecting subjects to be in our experiment, we have to make a couple of decisions. First, we have to determine what is the target population. So obviously in an experiment, we can't involve everybody in the total population, okay? We have to select a smaller sample. So we want to figure out ultimately who do we want our experimental results to generalize to. So again, if we're working in a single prison, and let's say we're working with juvenile offenders, we want our experimental results to apply to juvenile offenders across the board. But ultimately, we're restricted in the fact that we have to just draw a small sample of juvenile offenders from this one institution. And then we have to determine how we're actually going to select members from that target population to be included in the experiment. So what our inclusion and exclusion criterion are. The final element is random assignment. So this is the central feature of the classic experiment. It's not always possible to do random assignment, but this is the best case scenario. And basically how random assignment works is it just means that we randomly assign folks to either be in the treatment group or in the control group. And usually we use some kind of a probability mechanism to do this. So we might flip a coin, and all people who get heads, they end up in the treatment group, and all folks who get tails end up in the control group. And the whole point of this is basically just to create groups that are equivalent and also to reduce sources of systematic bias. So I'll now just walk you through a basic example of how an experiment might work. Let's just pretend that we have a video about the dangers of alcohol abuse, and we're hoping that if we show this video to undergrads, that it will reduce their amount of drinking. So the research question then becomes, does a video about alcoholism reduce drinking in undergraduate college students? And we're hypothesizing that because the video exposes students to the dangers of drinking to excess, that those students who actually see the video, it'll have an effect on them and on their future behavior, so they'll actually drink less. So we're arguing that students who watch the video will report drinking less alcohol than students who did not see the video. And so we can actually do an experiment to test this. So our independent-dependent variable relationship, we're modeling the causal relationship between showing this video and the amount of drinks that a student has or their alcohol intake. So the independent variable is going to be the alcoholism video, and then the dependent variable is going to be a measure of the amount of drinks that a student has in a month. So to set this up, we're interested in reaching the population of the university at large. So we would sample 100 students from the university population. And we'd have all of our 100 students complete a questionnaire asking them questions about their drinking habits. So we might ask them, for instance, how many drinks did you have in the last month? And this is our pre-test measure. Then we would randomly assign students to either be in the treatment group or the control group. And we might do this, like I mentioned earlier, with the flip of a coin. So, I have Johnny walk up to me. I flip a coin. He gets heads. Okay, so he's in the experimental group. Mary comes up next. Flip the coin. She gets tails. All right, she's in the control group. The idea here is that we use random assignment to randomly assign our students to our treatment control groups, so we get groups that are statistically equivalent, okay? And let's say in the end we end up with 50 in our treatment group and 50 in our control group. So the treatment group is going to see the alcohol video. Our control group is going to see nothing. And then we'll follow up with them 1 month later, and we'll give them the same questionnaire and ask them to now report how many drinks have you had in the last month. So if the alcohol video is truly effective at reducing the amount of drinking, what we should see is less drinking in our students in the treatment group at that second post-test measure, and drinking should stay the same for the control group students at both times. Okay, so we should see a lot of drinking from both groups prior to the video, and then we should see a reduction of drinking in the students that were shown the video in our treatment group after they've seen the video, whereas the control group, it should stay the same. So I'm just going to briefly walk through the design notation. So the book introduces you to the classic notation is provided by Campbell and Stanley in 1966, and this helps us to kind of better visualize and understand how experiments work. So here's basically what the syntax looks like. So O stands for observation or measurement. X is going to be our external, our experimental stimulus, and then T is going to be our time point. So here's how the classic experiment actually works. So as you can see, we have our experimental group and our control group. So again, remember the experimental group is the students that are seeing the video on alcoholism. The control group are the students that are receiving nothing. And then here's the measurements and actions at each point in time. So at time 1, we administer questionnaires across both groups asking students to tell us how much they drink. So we have observation occurring at time 1 in our experimental group and in our control group. Then at time 2, we actually administer the video. So our experimental group at time 2 gets to see the alcohol video. Our control group students don't see anything at time 2. Nothing happens to them. And then at time 3, we administer the questionnaire once again. So we administer the questionnaire across both groups, our experimental group and our control group. If the experiment is effective, and if the alcohol video itself is effective at reducing drinking, we should see less drinking in our experimental group at time 3 compared to our control group at time 3. Okay, so we want to compare those. The drinking in the control group at time 1 and time 3 should be roughly the same, but we should see a reduction in the drinking in the experimental group. We should see less drinking at time 3, and we should see even less drinking than the students in the control group. So basically that's how this would play out if we were to actually do an experiment. So that wraps it up for experiments. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email and I would be happy to address them.